edition of Now in North Korea focuses on North Korea's quiet change. The most important recent topic in North Korean politics is the emergence of Kim Jong-un's daughter, Kim-Ju애. How will Kim-Ju애's presence stir the North Korean elite? Additionally, a new class of wealthy elites is emerging in North Korea. These newly wealthy individuals who have generated high profits from the markets that have developed since the arduous march of the 1990s, maintain very close ties with the traditional elite. As North Korea's market expand, the regime's approach to these markets has also strengthened. Although various goods and information circulate in North Korea, surveillance by information police is also intensifying. Conversely, resistance among North Korean citizens is quietly progressing. This episode preliminarily examined the key issues in North Korean politics, including Kim-Ju애, the elite supporting her, and the regime response to the marketization of North Korean economy. First, Professor Sheena Chestnut Greitens from the University of Texas at Austin discusses the interaction between the emerging elite and the traditional elite in North Korea. Second, Professor Edward Goldring from the University of Melbourne explains who is more important to Kim Jong-un, Kim-Ju애 or Kim Yo-jong. Third, Professor Stephen Denney from Leiden University discusses the scope and limits of information dissemination in North Korean society through markets. Finally, Professor Benjamin Katzeff Silberstein from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem details the history of citizens' resistance in North Korea.
What I wanted to do today is to talk a bit about some of the changes that have emerged in the lives of ordinary North Koreans and where those come from in terms of changes to the state's approach to the political economy of North Korea. And so I wanted to start by introducing a concept called market Leninism that I believe has increasingly come to characterize North Korea's political economy. I should probably note here that there's an article that lays out some of these arguments, although not all of what I'm about to say today, on the development of market Leninism under Kim Jong-un in North Korea that was co-authored with one of my PhD students, Benjamin Katzeff Silberstein, and so I just want to make sure that he's properly credited for being a co-author on parts of what I'm about to say today. So the idea behind the concept of market Leninism in North Korea is that Pyongyang has responded to a set of changes that have unfolded in North Korea since the 1990s that scholars have characterized as marketization from below. And marketization from below has to do with the loss of state control, the collapse of the public distribution system during the arduous march, the loss of control over strictures on internal mobility, and the rise of grassroots black or gray markets, both within North Korea itself and across the river border with northeastern China, in particular with the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture. And so market Leninism emerges from the idea that faced with several decades of marketization from below that threatened to erode state control over economic activity and over the revenue that it generated, that Pyongyang responded to that marketization from below with a set of policy changes aimed at combining market activity with enhanced political control. This has really been a development that we've seen most sort of cohesively emerge or most strongly emerge, although it has emerged gradually and piecemeal during the period of Kim Jong-un's time in power. And so it really is a Kim Jong-un era phenomenon. So that we're really, focused on the changes that have rolled out over the course of the last decade. The way I see the goal of the market Leninist framework that North Korea has adopted is that Pyongyang is seeking to institutionalize a subset of market practices, those that are acceptable to the regime. I'll come back to that in a moment. So to institutionalize acceptable market practices within a strong political and ideological framework that stabilizes and strengthens single-party rule, so rule by Kim Jong-un at the head of the Korean Workers' Party. And there's been some good scholarship looking at how Kim Jong-un, in both preparing for succession and in the time since he's been in the leadership role, has reinvigorated the party as a complement to the military first politics, and in some ways to weaken a bit the military first politics that characterized North Korea under Kim Jong-il. So this makes North Korea a bit more like China and Vietnam today than Soviet or European communism of the late Cold War. And I say that because there's often a tendency in North Korean studies, for really valid and useful reasons, to focus on comparing North Korea to its Stalinist or its at least Soviet comparator. And what we see is happening, particularly under Kim Jong-il, is this shift toward a model that is the one that we see unfolding with different constraints and conditions in contemporary China and in contemporary Vietnam. Most of the work on China refers to this as party-state capitalism. So you can kind of pick your term. Both that and Market-Leninism refer to this combination of institutionalized market practices with strong political control. And so in the North Korean case, some of the key moments in the development of this on the economic side were the June 28th and the May 30th measures, which occurred in 2012 and 2014. North Korea also has adapted and redeployed 5-year economic plans. It had one in 2016 and another in 2021. And revisions to the enterprise law, which occurred primarily in 2020, as well as some changes to the way that special economic zones are both sort of promoted and employed in the overall fabric of the DPRK's political economy. As it relates to political control, the key sort of steps that Kim Jong-un has taken to strengthen political control have to do with the law on reactionary ideology, which formally has a bit longer and more cumbersome name, but which was updated in 2020 and 2022. Broader campaigns against foreign media, including even, I think last week I was reading a set of reports coming out of North Korea, all of which are very hard to verify, but reports of execution of a relatively large number of young people for consumption of foreign media that had been provided or circulated by defector groups that are based in South Korea. Another feature of the push toward tightened political control is an anti-corruption campaign. And this is actually a really interesting feature of Kim Jong-un's governance that I don't think has received a lot of attention outside of very specific academic circles. There's a really fantastic book by scholar Chris Carruthers on corruption control in authoritarian regimes that goes back and actually unpacks some of the ways in which Kim Jong-un's anti-corruption campaigns parallel some of the anti-corruption campaigns that were deployed by Kim Il-sung. So the use of purges as a tool of political control, but also more broadly, the use of anti-corruption to try to crack down on officials from the most senior levels of the Korean Workers' Party and the military all the way down to more reports of more local inspections at the provincial or the city level. And, this is obviously unfolded in a decade in which China has also drawn much more global attention for its own anti-corruption campaigns and crackdowns. But again, that's an area where North Korea's focus on anti-corruption campaigns as a tool of political control parallel probably contemporary China and now Vietnam, where we have a series of very high-profile anti-corruption investigations unfolding at present. And certainly that's another data point that suggests that China and Vietnam are appropriate comparators. We actually know from the comparative politics literature that countries, that diffusion of policy ideas and of regime features tends to occur not just geographically, but among clusters or networks of regimes of similar type. And so it's not surprising in some ways that North Korea, China, and Vietnam, as Leninist regimes and regimes that are characterized by Communist Party rule and strong leadership at the top, might adopt some of these similar features. So that's a sort of a known finding in the comparative authoritarian literature, that there's diffusion not just among geography, but among regime subtypes, and so that sort of strengthens the prior that we might have, that North Korea, China, and Vietnam might pursue parallel or similar policy tracks and might more easily learn from each other, because it's easier to apply lessons if a regime is more similar to one's own, if you are an autocrat. And then the final feature of political control has to do with border controls, especially under COVID. The North Korean regime had a very strong justification on public health grounds to really enhance border controls and border security in ways that decimated the number of North Koreans who were able to cross the border and make their way to South Korea during that time. The market Leninism arose because the regime in Pyongyang had a set of problems that had emerged from marketization from below that it needed to solve politically in order to feel like it had a handle on political stability and political control for the regime, for the regime's sake. So, the first of these is that marketization and the development of black and gray markets and cross-border trade with China, licit and illicit, and everything in between, produced a mismatch between the economic status of citizens and the political status of citizens. Right? North Korea, we all know, is extraordinarily politically hierarchical in terms of its designation of citizens into a set of political classes. But marketization from below brought the emergence of a set of nouveau riche citizens who had made money from trade and been able to survive, even economically maybe flourish, who had different interests in the political and economic order than the sort of local party cadres, who often were slower to participate in market activity, especially in the early years of marketization from below. And so there you have, political interests and economic interests not aligned, and the risk that an entrepreneurial middle class or an entrepreneurial class of some kind will emerge as a force of either local or even more broad opposition to the regime and its policies. Marketization from below also produced a loss of the ability to collect revenue. Previously, North Korea depended on a model of revenue generation where the state monopolized the assets used to produce revenue and had mechanisms by which it could capture that revenue at the point either of origin or when it entered North Korea from abroad. And so marketization from below eroded the ability to capture that revenue. It also produced a growing information asymmetry in citizens' favor and against the regime, or maybe again, eroded the information dominance of the North Korean regime for a time, as citizens could hide and did hide that black market economic activity from the state, especially at higher levels. And then it created some principal agent problems with respect to local officials, who benefited in many cases economically from turning a blind eye and forbearing on enforcing some of the directives to crack down on market activity that might be coming from Pyongyang at various points. So I raise this because market Leninism as a set of policy responses, I think, took steps to address each of these problems. And so I'll go through each of those in turn, and then I'll wrap up and turn to questions and discussion. First, the changes in things like the measures that were adopted in 2012 and 2014, as well as those related to the special economic zones, tended to increase enterprise-level autonomy somewhat, not to the extent that we've seen in China, for example, or even in parts of Vietnam's reforms, but did increase enterprise-level autonomy in both industry and agriculture, and created some incentives for production by shifting the balance so that citizens or enterprises were able to keep a larger portion of the revenue or the product that they generated. And so that shifted the incentives somewhat and allowed citizens to benefit from these new regulations that the regime was imposing. It also formalized governance of black market activity that was largely ungoverned and or illicit. And formalizing previously black market activity had a couple of different sub-effects. First, it just increased the regime's ability to regulate and collect revenue on that activity. If you can see it, if you can track it, if it has to be reported and it's regulated, then you can tax it or institute fees. And so the regime actually increased its ability to capture some of the revenue. It didn't completely get rid of the misalignment between local officials in Pyongyang, but it created tighter alignment because more of the revenue was going in at the local level. And so there was less incentive for some of the local officials to collude with economic elites in hiding that revenue and that activity from the center. It also reduced the information asymmetry by making economic activity more legible to state authorities. One important additional effect of that was really that we interpret this as an effort to co-opt this new nouveau riche class or subclass. By offering, let me be clear that it is partial and bounded legitimation of their activity, but at least partly legitimating some of this activity to avoid it being something that was totally in opposition to the directives of the state, and making it such that you could be a politically loyal citizen and engage in some of this activity and make some money and have a certain level of economic livelihood that you could provide for yourself without having to directly defy the regime's dictates to do it. And so the thinking is that this is aimed at potentially allowing North Korea to avoid the entrepreneurial middle class coalescing into an oppositional force, as we've seen in other authoritarian political systems. That, again, depends on the coexistence of these changes with tighter political control and strong enforcement of that tighter political control, including, for example, the reports of executions for consumption of foreign subversive or foreign media content, which it's pretty clear that North Korea regarded as not just a sort of an annoyance or a governance problem, but actually a threat to regime security itself and to the sort of purity of North Korean ideology, which must avoid contamination by foreign ideas and information. The only thing I'll say in closing is that what I've outlined here are the steps that, this is very much a state of play. It's an evolving interaction between the state and society. And as the state puts in regulations, citizens will weigh those and experience those at the local level and experience how they're actually implemented and come up with their own adaptations to work with, and in some cases around, some of these new measures. And so I want to be clear that in outlining the existence of the regime's strategy of market Leninism, I am not in any way suggesting either that it has been successful entirely or that it will be successful indefinitely going forward. Those are separate things, and I want to make clear that the analysis is very much one and not the other. But I hope that gives some sense of how the state's policy framework that it's put out piecemeal and gradually over the course of the last decade has shifted some of the experience in the daily lives of North Koreans, particularly those who are either local officials or who were engaged in black market activity previously, and gives us a starting point for a little bit of discussion and conversation.
By last question, actually, then you actually talk about the nouveau riche, their emerging and then growing influence in the North Korean regime. I think it's as a authoritarian leader in a one party or Kim family personalist regime. Kim Jong-un and his ruling clique are probably threatened by this emerging class, because they have money. And at the same time, you're talking about, anti-corruption drive, to actually control all this type of, new emerging class. At the same time, those collaborators, from within, the conventional, traditional elites. And from this perspective, what does the Kim Jong-un regime, need to co-opt this nouveau riche further, to, I think, is completely within the system and be a loyal supporter of the Kim Jong-un in the next couple of decades? Hard question, I know.
Gosh, there's a lot going on in that question, so let me try to answer it coherently and without rambling, which may be tricky because there are a couple of different parts to that question. First, I think one of the tools that we haven't talked about that is more social is intermarriage. And that for lots of reasons, one way to get the advantages of both political status, which is sort of the old guard and the vested existing political interests in North Korea, and the economic nouveau riche, the benefits of that status, is for families to intermarry. And there have been some reports, some really interesting reports, particularly from people who've left North Korea in the last 5 to 7 years of that phenomenon rising as families sort of and individuals seek to get the benefits of both worlds. So that's not to say that marriage is entirely strategic and sort of instrumental in North Korea. I don't want to dehumanize it in that way by suggesting that's all it is. But we've heard reports that that's a phenomenon that has, it's a non-economic tool by which we've seen local actors try to combine the best of both worlds, so to speak. So I think that's one piece of it. That's obviously not something the regime necessarily is ordering, right? So to your question about what could the regime do more? I think it's going to be a continued combination of sticks and carrots. So one, function that the anti-corruption campaigns serve is as a reminder that it's okay to make money. It's okay to prosper if you do it in the way and according to the rules laid out by the regime, and you stay within certain political boundaries. And having that prospect, that promise, that carrot, combined with the stick of, and if you politically step out of line, then there is this potential for a really harsh anti-corruption campaign or investigation to come your way. I think is a fairly powerful combination of stick and carrot that we've seen again, deployed in China, but also heard consistently as a feature of Kim Jong-un's governance as well. So those are the main things that I see to be likely going forward. But again, to say that this is what I think the regime will try to do, every authoritarian regime tries to maximize its own chances of survival and to get the most loyalty and adherence, fidelity from citizens that it can. North Korea is maybe on one end of the spectrum in that regard, but certainly not unique. And I think that that's not to say that these efforts work perfectly. There are, even in a system that aims at totalitarianism, as I think North Korea often has and does, there are still gaps and spaces and the sort of the sphere of state control is still not 100%, and that's what kind of makes trying to understand how these really ambitious policy changes on the part of the state, how they do actually trickle down and impact the daily lives of North Koreans. That's actually part of what makes the process of trying to understand that so fascinating. So I think it's likely to, as I said earlier, that sort of back and forth cat and mouse is likely to continue. But I think the North Korean regime will continue to experiment with those sticks and carrots and try to make sure that whatever market activity occurs can still be disciplined, regulated, and accrued to the state's benefit.
Good. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, Professor Edward Goldring. And then you are going to discuss about quiet changes in daily life of North Korean. And I think it's the commoners and more like, the normal people. And then we are grateful, to have you today. And then the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me and for the quick introduction. And thanks to the Yonsei University Research Team and the Ministry of Unification for organising and commissioning this. Okay, so obviously I'm presenting in English and I apologize for not presenting in Korean, but it's a work in progress, ongoing struggle. Okay, so I'm a lecturer in political science specialising in comparative politics at Melbourne. Just for anyone who's watching and not familiar, I work on comparative autocracy and have a particular interest in North Korea. And the main topics I'm working on are purges and succession, and the QR code on screen links to my personal website if you're interested in reading a bit more about the projects I've published or am currently working on. Okay, so then to summarize what I'll cover today, I was asked to discuss two questions. The first is about who is currently more beneficial to Kim Jong-un, relating to two family members in particular. The second question is whether anyone is immune to purges in North Korea. And the third is of my own choosing, and this is where the management of elites in North Korea, including under Kim Jong-un, is driven by concerns about a coup. And so I'll take each of these three questions in turn. So turning then to the first question of who is currently more beneficial to Kim Jong-un, Kim Yo-jong or Kim Ju애. So I think we first need to think about, well, what does beneficial actually mean? So when we say this is beneficial for Kim Jong-un, what are we talking about? So in comparative autocracy and in the study of political leaders more generally, think of selectorate theory, for instance, if you're familiar with it, there's this assumption that autocrats want to stay in power. But as authors like Tom Popinski and Adam Przeworski have argued, autocrats do so much more than stay in power. They invariably also have certain policy goals that they want to achieve. And of course, these can be about aiding survival. So, for instance, a dictator might want improved economic performance because this improves the standard of living for the general population. But that also might make the population be less restless and then help with their survival prospects, for instance. And improved economic performance can, of course, also provide greater resources for the dictator to distribute as private goods. But many dictators also have policy goals that they want to achieve for the end results of those policy goals. So lots of dictators care about the legacies that they leave behind. And so when we're talking about beneficial to Kim Jong-un, I assume that other individuals within the North Korean regime can provide benefits to Kim Jong-un in terms of, one, helping him survive in office, delivering stability, and two, actually helping him deliver certain policies that he wishes to deliver. In terms of stability, Kim Ju애 provides benefits as if she is, as it appears, being prepared to be Kim's successor. So succession has long been thought to be a thorny problem for autocratic regimes to solve, but they're getting better at it in more recent years. So North Korea has, of course, pulled it off twice, in 1994 and then more recently in 2011 with the transition from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. So public appearances by Kim Ju애 alongside her father, Kim Jong-un, in particular at military events, have led to speculation that she's being groomed as his successor. We should note that this might not be the case, and that this could in fact be part of something else. So it could, for instance, be part of an image building campaign to portray Kim Jong-un as a loving father, both of his immediate family and also his broader family of the North Korean people. But certain terms that have been used to refer to Kim Ju애 in North Korean propaganda indicate that Kim Ju애's status is being elevated within the regime to that of a potential future leader. So research on comparative autocracy has shown that identifying a future leader can help stabilize the regime because this stops elites fighting over who the next successor will be. Now, identifying a daughter is unusual. It's normally a son. Autocracies are patriarchal organizations generally. But identifying a child as successor is especially helpful because then the incumbent, in this case Kim Jong-un, doesn't have to fear the future successor overthrowing him because the successor can afford to wait by virtue of being significantly younger than the incumbent. And this practice, known as primogeniture, was of course widely practiced in particular in pre-modern monarchical Europe. And so this is how dictators resolve what's known as the crown prince problem. If autocratic regimes cannot solve the problem of succession, then they collapse. So Kim Ju애 appears hugely beneficial to Kim Jong-un because she aids stability through her possible designation as North Korea's future leader. However, I would argue that Kim Yo-jong is currently even more beneficial to Kim Jong-un. As vice director of the Korean Workers' Party's propaganda and agitation department, Kim Yo-jong appears to have played an important role in organizing major public events in North Korea, devising projects that aid Kim Jong-un's personality cult, and often acting as the North Korean regime's attack dog towards South Korea. But Kim Yo-jong is not just beneficial for Kim Jong-un in terms of policy. Although our inferences are based on limited evidence, Kim Jong-un's health appears to be suboptimal. Visible health indicators, including the amount he smokes, his family's history of major heart issues, his weight, and his disappearance for 2 months in April 2020, all point to the idea that Kim Jong-un suffers from poor health. To be clear, I'm not saying that I expect Kim Jong-un to die from a heart attack in the next few weeks, months, or possibly even years, but this is a possibility that we should consider, as he likely also has. Now, we don't know exactly how old Kim Ju애 is, but if Kim Jong-un died in, say, the next 5 to 10 years, even if Kim Ju애 has been designated as North Korea's next leader, her young age means that she'd almost certainly need a ward to help her lead the country due to her young age. As an albeit female member of the Kim family in a patriarchal world, Kim Yo-jong is arguably best positioned to do that. There is, of course, an alternative argument that Kim Yo-jong poses a problem for Kim Jong-un. Sorry, there's an argument that Kim Yo-jong poses a problem for Kim Ju애, in that if Kim Yo-jong took on the role of sort of ward to Kim Ju애, that she might not want to relinquish this sort of power behind the throne, just as Kim Jong-il apparently feared about Jang Song-taek helping Kim Jong-un before he died. But it's worth noting that Kim Yo-jong does not have anything like Jang Song-taek's checkered history, given that Jang was purged on multiple occasions under Kim Jong-il, most notably in 2004. So overall, I believe that Kim Yo-jong is currently more beneficial to Kim Jong-un, because if Kim Yo-jong can be trusted from Kim Jong-un's perspective, she provides not only policy support in the invaluable area of propaganda, but she also aids the regime's stability by increasing the likelihood that the leadership of the regime can continue within the Kim family, even in the event of Kim Jong-un suffering an early death due to health complications. So the second question of whether there is a group of North Korean elites that is immune to purges. Now, for clarity, I'm answering this question in the context only of the Kim Jong-un era. But to preview my answer, yes, I think elites with technical expertise related to the missile and nuclear programs could be immune to purges, but this being North Korea, even that comes with a caveat. So in a book manuscript that's currently under review, I argue that there are 3 primary reasons why dictators purge elites. First, dictators do this to consolidate power. For reasons that I'm happy to talk about at length afterwards, dictators are generally in a strong position when they first come to office. At this time, they often purge elites to consolidate power. They typically target powerful military elites at this time, because these guys tend to be the perpetrators of coups. And so dictators take advantage of their temporarily strong position when they first come to power vis-a-vis the military. In North Korea under Kim Jong-un, think of Kim being able to purge Vice Marshal Lee Yong-ho in July 2012, for instance. Second, dictators purge elites to punish them for disloyal behavior. This is most often seen following a failed coup attempt, which helps explain why there's such a strong association between coup attempts and purges. Dictators have to purge the perpetrators of failed coup attempts lest they try to unseat the dictator again. Amazingly, there are actually examples of dictators failing to purge the perpetrators of failed coup attempts, and then the perpetrators launching a second coup attempt, which is quite frankly baffling, but it has happened. And then also dictators need to send a signal to other elites that challenges against them will not be tolerated. So you can think of them as like an act of micro-deterrence within elite politics in an autocracy. So we've not seen this type of purge, as far as I can tell, under Kim Jong-un, since to our knowledge he's not faced a coup attempt, but Kim Il-sung's purges in the aftermath of the Second Conference of the Korean Workers' Party in 1956, targeting the Kapsan faction, are arguably a good example of this. We could also point to purges in the mid-90s, potentially related to the Frunze Academy incident under Kim Jong-il. Third, dictators purge elites to scapegoat them as a form of blame shifting. So the aim of this type of purge is to improve a dictator's popular opinion of what is wrong. In North Korea, the clearest examples of this have occurred under Kim Jong-il, with Kim Jong-il purging civilian elites, including So Kwan-hee, who served as the Minister of Agriculture, and this was to blame So Kwan-hee for the famine. And then, even more notably, Kim Jong-il purged an official called Park Nam-gi, finance minister, and Park Nam-gi was purged in response to the disastrous currency devaluation towards the end of 2009. So, as I mentioned, these arguments are from a book manuscript that's currently under review, and in the concluding chapter, I apply the logic of these arguments to three dictators, including Kim Jong-un, to try and predict who might be purged in future. In Kim Jong-un's North Korea, I predicted the most likely type of purge would be scapegoats, purges of civilian elites. Since Kim Jong-un has consolidated power, and a coup attempt is very unlikely. And indeed, in the last few weeks, there have been reports of Kim Jong-un blaming officials, saying irresponsible officials would be punished for the North Korean state's response to damage caused by the floods. We can also apply these arguments to consider who is likely not at risk of purges in Kim Jong-un's North Korea. So I argue that officials associated with the missile and nuclear programs are unlikely to be purged. Since, but specifically I'm talking about senior officials in North Korea's General Directorate of Missiles. So purging these officials would not provide any benefit in terms of consolidation. They're unlikely also to be disloyal and launch a coup attempt because they're generally treated comparatively well within North Korean standards. And they're unlikely to be scapegoated even if things go wrong, because this wouldn't aid popular views of Kim Jong-un within the country. And also, because failed missile tests do not have negative effects on Kim Jong-un's standing among the people. Kim has also demonstrated a respect for technical expertise, especially in this area. When missile launches have not gone to plan, Kim has shown patience. He seems to understand that the field of missile development, nuclear weapons, this is an extremely complex area. And he celebrates, as the picture shows, joyously with officials, heralding their accomplishments when they make advances, i.e. hold successful missile launches. He's even held banquets for scientists and publicly saluted those behind successful missile launches. Now, of course, I said there was a caveat, and that caveat is that if any of these officials did display disloyalty, such as participating in a challenge to Kim Jong-un, then of course they would be purged. But for reasons that I'll discuss next, this is unlikely. So overall, officials who play key roles in the regime's nuclear and missile programs are as close to being immune to Korea. Finally then, the third question I'm discussing today is whether management of elites in North Korea, including under Kim Jong-un, is driven by concerns about a coup. Now, of course, there aren't many good pictures about a coup in North Korea, so I had to go for Kang Chol-pi, which if you haven't seen, I thoroughly recommend if you want to think what a coup might look like in North Korea. So one assumption underpinning my responses to the two questions above is that the Kims, including Kim Jong-un, worry about the possibility of a coup. In the context of succession, and this is something that underpins research in the field of comparative autocracy, as dictators grow old or become visibly unwell, the likelihood of a coup increases. Similarly, if we're talking about purges, as I have, research on purges also assumes that dictators' fear of and their responses to coup attempts affects their behavior, i.e. it affects whether they fear a coup affects whether they purge elites. Over the years, however, when I've conducted interviews with experts on North Korean politics in South Korea, whether in government-related think tanks or in academia, this is something that interviewees have often pushed back on, telling me that there's such a minuscule chance, or there's just no chance of a coup in North Korea, that this isn't what guides thinking among previously either among Kim Jong-il or for Kim Jong-un. And this filters through to some academic work. For instance, Taekbin Kim's quantitative analysis of purges in North Korea frames purges as not being about coup threats. Instead, Taekbin Kim argues that purges aim to, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, increase the efficiency of dictatorial rule, with dictators showing off their superiority and making their subordinates more obedient to the group. In other words, for Taekbin Kim, the idea of purge is to incentivize loyalty. But I would argue that arguments such as these obfuscate the logic of much elite management in North Korea. There's a very low chance of a coup in North Korea. I don't doubt that. But there's a low chance of a coup precisely because the Kims, including Kim Jong-un, have been very concerned with the possibility of one occurring. The Kims coup-proof constantly. They do this both reactively and proactively. Reactively, we've seen purges occur in North Korea, as I discussed, in response to rumored coup attempts, notably in the mid-1950s and the mid-1990s. Proactively, the North Korean regime regularly rotates officials to prevent them developing strong vertical and horizontal relationships between military officials that could aid the occurrence of a coup attempt. The regime also engages in counterbalancing, with leadership of the defense of Pyongyang and the leader's bodyguard being run separately and distinctly from the regular military chain of command. Political officers and security command offers from North Korea's internal military secret police are also embedded in North Korea's regular military, their monitoring activities further diminishing the likelihood. Similarly, Taekbin Kim's argument that I mentioned can be reconsidered in light of this evidence. If purges are about a dictator showing off their superiority to make subordinates more obedient, this is about making obedience more loyal to diminish the likelihood of a challenge, i.e. diminish the likelihood of a coup attempt. To reiterate then, while I completely concur with many experts inside and outside of academia that a coup in North Korea is extremely unlikely, I contend that this is primarily because the Kims, including Kim Jong-un, have been so concerned with the possibility of a coup occurring. Okay, so that brings an end to my prepared remarks. Thanks again, Professor, for the invitation to present, and of course, look forward to any questions.
Thank you for very calm and then very systematic analysis of these three questions. And then I think you started as a very interesting remark. And then our comparative political scientist actually contributed to the more stable authoritarian succession process by our research that you are arguing. You just mentioned that those established literature and accumulating literature on authoritarian succession process might benefit those potential authoritarian leaders to solve the problem of succession politics, which is not very good for us.
No, this thought has
any empirical evidence to support this argument?
This thought has crossed my mind many times, right? And of course, Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alistair Smith made a whole joke about this when they published their sort of popular book that's the version of selectorate theory, when they called it the Dictator's Handbook to Survival. Essentially, what many comparative political scientists are doing is writing guides for dictators on how to stay in power. I don't have any evidence of whether this is actually true, and if it was the whole field, we've got a massive moral issue we need to deal with. But it has crossed my mind, and I have wondered whether there is some kind of empirical research we could do on this involving looking at where does this research tend to get downloaded? Like, is it possible to identify what are they called? The ISPs of where people download like these articles. And if, for instance, we see them being repeatedly downloaded in headquarters in Beijing, like, what are we all doing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think this is agonizing consequence on comparative political scientists. Even though we study political regime and then political democratic backsliding, I think one of the emerged as one of the top the research topic in the among the comparativists. But our research, the results actually shows we should do this. You shouldn't do that to prevent democratic backsliding. It didn't work. But the other way around, you find the succession problem deserved for the dictators. That type of research results actually benefit the dictators, which is not very good.
I think, to give a more serious response, I think this is something I've been thinking a lot about. And I think, when you read articles or books and it comes to the conclusion and authors think about the implications of their results, I think what we really need to be thinking about is not just theoretical debates that this contributes to, but what are the implications for, pro-democratic policymakers? You mentioned democratic backsliding. I mean, in that field, for instance, I love Laura Gamboa's book on democratic backsliding because it actually provides very sort of clear advice and a template plan for people to follow on if you want to stop democratic backsliders, this is how you can do it, as opposed to if you're a wannabe autocrat and want to engage in backsliding, how do you do it? And so I think we need to think more about implications for pro-democratic policymakers.
But I think it's economic officials at the top or in the middle, and they are very, very in the very dangerous position to be purged as a scapegoat. I think your theory, consolidation, punishment, scapegoating, make very sense. I would love to read your forthcoming book. And then next question is again, it's about coup. And then you actually showed the 강철비, the movie. I think I saw it. I think it's North Korean leaders will hate it about that. And then you just say you want to see one scenario of the say potential coup in North Korean regime. Just watch the film, 강철비. Then I think it's the real question to you one more time. This is hypothetical, of course, but you studied, and then I think I studied military coup and then authoritarian turnover and then succession process, and then I think you have many scenarios from the previous cases especially in the modern time. You briefly mentioned about pre-modern monarchical Europe too, so you have a kind of horizon of the last 400-500 years. What is a plausible coup scenario in North Korea right now then, or next 10 years? I think it's many people, I think including myself, it's a coup probability possibility is pretty low in the North Korea right now, and then probably next 5 years or so. We do not predict 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years. But if any, what is the potential and plausible coup scenario in North Korea?
So I completely agree. I think the probability of a coup in North Korea is very, very low in the next 5-10 years, and including even in the scenario I'm going to outline, I still think the probability of a coup is low. But if I had to outline one scenario in which a coup attempt might happen, I think it would be relating to succession. So I think it would be if, say, Kim Jong-un has, say, a stroke or a heart attack, thinking of his father, and if the succession plan to, say, elites in the military starts to become clear that, look, this is going to be a female-centered succession plan based on potentially Kim Ju애의 with support of Kim Yo-jong or just Kim Yo-jong, then how do senior male military officials react to this? To be clear, and I'm going to say it again, I still think the probability of a coup is low, because I think what autocratic regimes have come to realize is that the most essential thing is that, to use and to speak figuratively, we keep the train on the tracks. And the train here is the North Korean regime. So if they feared that Kim Ju애 or Kim Yo-jong coming to power could lead to the collapse of the North Korean regime, and that some of these senior military officials end up in The Hague being tried for war crimes, then I think they want to step in and would consider a coup attempt. But I think they would realize, look, our best chance of keeping the regime intact is to, say, support Kim Ju애, Kim Yo-jong, whoever is the designated successor. And so that's why I still think the chance of a coup would be low. I've actually, just one additional thing, I'm working on a new data set of all successions in the world, but we've so far only collected the data for Asia between the end of the Second World War and 2020. But even looking just at Asia, the regularity of successions over time steadily increases. We started an average of about sort of less than 1 a year in 1946, and now we're sort of getting up to like an average of 2 a year, which might not sound like much, but is actually, if you think there shouldn't be succession every year, that's actually a very big increase. And at the same time as the frequency of succession, i.e. regular transitions, has gone up, the frequency of irregular leadership transitions, i.e. coups, has gone in the complete opposite direction. So autocratic regimes are getting better at this. So I still think, look, if a coup attempt was to happen, I think that's how it would happen. But I still think it's very unlikely.
So, and then my last question before I let you go, North Korea has a very interesting intervening variable, very unique factor, nuclear weapons. And then, of course, People's Republic of China and then Russia Federation, they have, their nuclear weapons. And then Pakistan, which is a pretty hybrid regime, back and forth and democracy and military authoritarian regime, has nuclear weapons. But unique, your research and then many comparative political scientists' research are on those regime usually weak, and then at least in the highest level is probably middling type of authoritarian regime without nuclear weapon. In a nuclear weapon, you enter the nuclear weapon in this the formula, and then what's going to happen
in terms of the formula of whether we would expect a coup attempt?
Coup attempt, and then elite management, you say?
Yeah. Well, with regard to coup attempts, I mean, we have seen coup attempts in states with nuclear weapons. So we saw a coup attempt, of course, in sort of the end of the Soviet Union. We also have seen, I would argue we've seen successful coups in Pakistan. So coup attempts and successful coups are not completely absent from states with nuclear weapons. So I don't think this obviates the possibility of them occurring. In North Korea, one could even argue that maybe this is a factor that could increase the likelihood of a coup attempt if they saw, even the more senior, say, Kim Yo-jong, if she was to come to power, this is someone whose background, Kim Jong-un, I think, is it Kenji Fujimoto's book that discusses how he was nicknamed early on as the little general. He sort of was always pushed to have sort of some kind of training in the military, and during his grooming for succession, we think he took charge of various military two military events, including the sinking of the Cheonnan, to ensure that the military would respond to his commands. Kim Yo-jong, on the other hand, she's a civilian background. She's a party official. She does not have this military training. So maybe the presence of nuclear weapons arguably increases the likelihood of a coup, because if the military don't trust that this is someone who should sort of have overall command of North Korea's nuclear capabilities, maybe that makes them more likely to step in.
So, I mean, this is probably one other, path, for the North Korean regime, to probably, suffer, from the political succession process, very unstable, process. And I think it's the nuclear weapons. It's pretty interesting, factor, for the North Korea in every single, the policy, dimension. But I think it's important for the, succession process. And then probably according to your logic, and then we will see Kim-ju애 in military uniform pretty soon.
Yeah, maybe, or given, I mean, the events she appears at are already generally military missile events. And that sort of, to me, is one of the strongest indicators that she's not just appearing as his daughter to show him as a loving father, that this is leadership training. Of course, I'm not 100% on that, but that to me is an indicator. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if behind the scenes there is some kind of military training that takes place, and maybe we do see her in uniform at some point.
So, and then probably, Kim-ju애, become a 2-star or 3-star general in 5 years, and then 4-star general in 10 years.
Yeah, if she was a academic, she'd be promoted to full professor quicker than the rest of us can dream.
Okay, I think we can probably think that little girl general might emerge the 조선중앙통신, news media footage, pretty soon. I think this is interesting intellectual practice to think about the possibility of a coup and then stability and instability in the elite management in North Korea. Thank you so much for today.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and I really enjoyed the Q&A discussion. Yeah, really interesting questions. Thanks.
Dr. Stephen Denney, thank you for joining us. You will have 15 minutes in lecture, and at the same time, we will have 15 minutes Q&A session based upon what you're giving us. Okay, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Dr. Baek and the team at Now in North Korea, the new organization set up to bring together people working on North Korea with an interest in unification. Today, I'm going to be talking about some research that was done in collaboration with the the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, the point of which was to understand how information is and or can be disseminated within North Korea. Hence the title, Determinants of Foreign Information Use in North Korea. I'm going to present some research findings and implications from this research. As introduced, my name is Dr. Stephen Denney. I'm at Leiden University, a professor of international relations and Korean studies. Let's begin. This is related to the North Korean information environment. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit how I've studied the North Korean information environment, the particular tools I've used, and the people who I've interacted with in order to understand this, the findings from that research, and then some conclusions and discussion. So what determines foreign information use in North Korea? The title sort of gave it away, but this is the basic research question. Foreign information in North Korea is pretty much a continually hot topic. There's a lot of ways that we could think about this to situate it with in terms of real world events. But I think one of the most recent is, of course, the latest rendition of the information war between North and South Korea. This time we have the North in response to information coming into its sovereign territory. The response is to send trash-filled balloons. Now, of course, the conversation and discussion and context of this is sort of beyond the scope of this presentation, but I use this as an example of North Korea's sensitivity with regards to the spread of foreign information. Why is North Korea so sensitive about information flows and what comes in? Well, because its regime attempts to keep a close monitoring and cordon on information coming in. It seeks to only expose its citizens to regime-sanctioned information, the purpose of which is to bolster its legitimacy and its ability to rule. I'd be remiss to not mention that South Korea also does this to some extent, and all countries do this to some extent, really. South Korea also attempts to sort of limit certain types of information exposure to its citizens, but to a much less degree than North Korea. South Korea is, of course, a vibrant liberal democracy, a pluralistic society, and North Korea is neither of those things. It is a personalist dictatorship run by a party that attempts to restrict information. If you sort of disrupt that, the response is, in a sense, balloons coming your way. So the spread of foreign information inside authoritarian regimes more broadly is an interesting question of discussion. I'm not going to go into too much detail of that right now, but it is a bigger question of about information in autocratic regimes. Of course, North Korea is one of these. The North Korean government clearly worries and has worried about this issue and ways to control it. There's a number of reports, both academic and non-academic, that look at how North Korea sort of seeks to control information, leveraging existing state institutions for the purposes of monitoring and suppression. One of the ways that we have increasingly sought to understand the information environment in North Korea is through surveys of those who were former residents of North Korea. These are your North Korean defectors and North Korean defector migrants, refugees, and they have had firsthand experience with how information is disseminated, how information is controlled, and how they themselves interact with information. This is sort of where we're situating our interest here today in the interest of this research. There is evidence that suggests what is going on in North Korea in terms of what determines the spread of information, or more specifically, what determines whether or not someone uses a type of information. But there are limits to that. Some of these limits we're going to overcome. I'm going to show you how we overcome them. Some of these we cannot. So we cannot run sort of probabilistic surveys or nationally representative surveys of the North Korean population. Obviously, the North Korean regime would never allow that. But we can do the next best thing, I would argue, and that is to interact with people, to survey and to interview those who have come from that place in order to understand how that information circulates and what determines whether or not someone uses this. However, we believe that the tools that have been used to investigate what determines whether someone uses information and thus how information spreads in North Korea has been quite limited. No one has done in our assessment, a particularly good job at using existing social science research tools to understand what determines foreign information flows. And this is where we come in. So what we have done is this thing called the choice-based conjoint survey. It's a survey experiment that has been designed online that creates hypothetical scenarios for information use. So what we did is, in collaboration with our sponsor, the NED, and our NGO partners, primarily in South Korea, is we sat down with them and we said, what sort of information do you think about when you put together these information packets? Because of course, a lot of these NGOs are very politically active. We do have, of course, a normative undercurrent to our research project that is the free flow of information as a sort of democratic ideal. But we are also researchers at the end of the day, and we want to think about how best to understand this. We worked with these NGOs to understand generally these sort of information profiles, as we'll put them, and what constitutes them and how they were constructed. And then we've took these to create scenarios via this choice-based conjoint survey experiment design that we would then give to former residents of North Korea of a particular type. I'll get to the sample here in a second. And we use this to better understand what drives information decisions. So I'm going to actually just show you some examples of what this looks like instead of describing it more. But first, I want to tell you about the people who we surveyed. So, of course, defector surveys are not uncommon. I think they've become increasingly popular, or were quite popular for some time. Of course, with the slowdown in the number of defectors arriving to South Korea, this has changed this sort of research dynamic. Nevertheless, there's a little over 30,000, or roughly 30,000, former residents of North Korea in South Korea. And we surveyed 313 of them. I want to say that we went to great lengths to survey those for whom their connections to North Korea were fairly recent. So almost all of our sample had resettled in South Korea within 5 years, and many within 3. They most had left North Korea or defected from North Korea sometime after 2015. They're of a mixed and somewhat representative, if you will, background of North Korea. So this is a good mix of socioeconomic backgrounds, former party status, and other relevant metrics. You can ask me more questions about this later if you want to know. And I also want to address the fact that, contrary to research which seeks to understand North Korean society broadly, we're not trying to do that. We're trying to understand determinants of foreign information flow. And if that's the case, this is actually a better sample than a sort of general population survey would be, because those who have defected are those who are the people most likely to come into contact with foreign information, because firstly, they're from the borderland regions. Most are from North Hamgyong province, of course, and there's a more porous border with China where information can't enter. This makes them a better sample to understand those people who would have come into contact with information and the decisions that they would make about that information. So what we did was we designed this experiment, which I'm going to show you a snapshot of here in a second, where the respondents, these North Korean defector migrants, evaluated information profiles. They would be shown 2 hypothetical profiles of information that was designed based upon attributes which define foreign information. I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. And they would choose which of these 2 that they would most likely use when they were in North Korea. We also asked some other questions about how they would then distribute it, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Feel free to ask me some questions about that in the Q&A. They did this 10 times, and they evaluated 10 unique and randomly generated information profiles. These profiles, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, were defined by who provided it, where it was acquired, or where they came into that information. The distribution media, was it a USB or something else? The content of that information, is it South Korean content, i.e. a drama? Is it international content, like perhaps a documentary? The content form, was it a video, text, recorded file, an application? What age group did it target? This was something that came up a lot in our NGO consultations, not something we necessarily thought of. And then the type, is it nonfiction or fiction? We chose for something a little bit more general in order to capture the sort of the dynamics of information flow, rather than specifying like what type of South Korean drama. That makes it harder to generate these random pairs of hypothetical information profiles. That is, of course, both a strength and a limitation. We're going to focus today here on the provider and the acquisition place. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this now. We explore this more in the papers we wrote about this, which I'll link to at the end. But provider and acquisition place deals with elements that are important to understanding information flows, and especially in the literature on information flows in autocratic contexts. So this deals, of course, with trust in social capital, trust between people, social capital that is generated between people or is lacking between people, and how an authority figure like the state regulates space. Of course, information has to flow through space, and states are very interested in regulating spaces. So acquisition place comes into play here. So we're going to focus on that, but there's a lot more here. This is in English what this hypothetical scenario looked like. So we would introduce it to them. I didn't mention, and I want to mention here now, that we worked with an NGO partner by the name of Urion. Urion specializes, among other things, in defector migrant resettlement and in running surveys for international research groups. So we're able to work with our NGO partner, Urion, to recruit a high-quality sample, which we're able to monitor to implement quality control, to make sure we're interacting with who we want to interact with, and to make sure they understood it. So they were introduced to this. They had people on standby to help them in case they got confused, because running survey experiments with the North Korean defector migrant groups is a unique experience. Anyway, it looked like this. And not the best resolution, but the Korean language text looks like this. I'll pause on this for about 5 or 6 seconds so you can take a look at it. Okay, we can always come back to that during Q&A if we want to. So what do we find? What do we learn from this? I'm going to show you the results of the data in the type of statistical analysis that we conduct with choice-based conjoint data. We're going to look at a statistic called marginal means, and it looks a little bit like this. You're going to have the attribute of the profile, the level of the profile, so provider, who provided it, acquisition place, where was it provided. You're going to have a point estimate, which is going to tell you the marginal mean. And that marginal mean can be read, if you look there at the bottom, as the probability an information profile is chosen if attribute level is present. So it's kind of like a likelihood measure, a probability that this thing would work. And what you're looking for is point estimates above 0.5 or 50%. And that means that in this example here, if the provider was a friend, more than 50% of the time that information was used. That means it motivates use, acceptance, and facilitates information flows. So I've already kind of tipped my cap as to what we found. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go over this, but I do want to point out that you can look at this for all of the attributes of interest, but we're not going to go over those right now. This can be looked at later, or it can be looked up in the article that we've published on this matter. But let's focus here on what I call the main quantities of interest, that is provider and acquisition place. So what motivates information use in North Korea? A family or a friend or a family member provides it to you. Neighbors and strangers demotivate use because they're not trusted. That's the basic finding there. With regards to acquisition place, they would rather come into it in their own home. You have sort of outside park is like an unknown space. They don't know what's going on. It demotivates use. The market has a sort of positive direction, but it's not very large. However, I want to look at something which you can do here, the interaction effects, sort of conditional outcomes. And it looks a little bit something like this. So provider and place is our main quantities of interest. Let's interact them. So at the top left, you have another person's home, who provided it. So if it's at another person's home from a friend, that is perhaps the friend's home, it may motivate use and acceptance. Now, interestingly, and we focus a lot more on this in the paper, if you interact market by who provided it, you get a little bit different and a more instructive understanding of the dynamics of information use in North Korea. Markets are, of course, a place that the state regulates, but it's also sort of a semi-private space that innovative or dynamic things happen. And friend and family members providing stuff in a market is actually more likely to motivate information use than at home. If you're at your own home, that's the third at the bottom left there. Neighbor, friend, and family, potentially. Outside place, no one wants it there, basically. That is the finding. We also followed up with sort of questions to get sort of text-based responses, so qualitative responses. And what we learned is that people are interested to learn. Trust drives whether or not they use it. These are unsurprising findings about information in sort of an information cordon, or in a place where information is tightly controlled. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but they want to see and learn about the world in isolated North Korea. Of course they do. There's a tendency to watch South Korean dramas and films with friends you can trust and with family because you can go to prison if caught. Basically, the trust radius in North Korea is very tight. It's very small. And people are curious about the ways of life in capitalist or democratic countries. That's a tip to South Korea and other places. So people prefer content from friends and family delivered at home or possibly in the market, which I think is interesting. The state looms large, co-ops information flows in social capital. Social trust in North Korea is extremely low. This is not a surprising finding, but we have found another way to prove it with regards to information flows. Despite enormous risks, which we have not really talked about here for time's sake, North Koreans desire information about and entertainment from the outside world. As I mentioned, we have an article on this. It can be looked up here, how autocracies disrupt unsanctioned information flows using North Korea as a case study. You can look that up in Problems of Post-Communism. I thank you for your time and attention. I've enjoyed presenting some of my research here, and I hope that you've learned something. Again, many thanks to National Endowment for Democracy for funding this and our many NGO partners. Thank you.
Very informative and very stimulating research. I like that. And then our staffs are beside us, and me and they are very intrigued into this research. And I think it's good findings. And then there are many hypotheses we need to test. And I think you did already. And then quite interesting results. Let's start with social trust. And then what you are finding in North Korea, social trust is extremely low. But your research actually sampling, of course, this is a little bit biased because region bias, because those people the defected North Korea and then become a refugee and then settle down in probably in Canada, and then they are in the United States. And they are from Hamgyong province and then very border region. And then it might be a little bit tough question, but do you see this social trust level in this border area and then Pyongyang? And we know that Pyongyang citizens also watch Korean dramas and so on, and they got extremely curious about this the foreign information. And then fortunately or unfortunately they have diplomats and who are trade workers and then who are exposed to the outside already. And then what's your take on it?
So you are right to point out about the biased nature of the sample. There's no way to overcome that. And what we accept or claim on faith alone is that despite these being people from primarily the borderland space in North Korea, that they are still giving us answers and providing data that's broadly reflective of social dynamics in North Korea and how people would make decisions. I've been working with the North Korean defector community for about 10 years now. I've done a number of different surveys, not always on information use. So this one was kind of unique and pretty interesting just from a researcher's point of view, interacting with the community. But qualitatively, we've talked with people from the center, right? From Pyongyang, because that's those are people with higher levels, arguably, of social capital. They're more likely to have a party background. Just qualitatively, what we find is they talk about information in the same way. I think, if anything, the dynamics which we're revealing here are underplayed in Pyongyang, as in there's both a greater interest in foreign information, but there's also greater state capacity to regulate the spread of information. So I think as a Pyongyang citizen, using foreign information is more dangerous than it is if you're, if you're in some border town in North Hamgyong province, right? So I am not, I think what we're interested here is not really the specifics of like the point estimates, but basically the dynamics that this reveals. In some ways, I think you could say our findings are extremely obvious and completely unsurprising. And I think that would, in terms of like broader academic contributions, there is something to that. But in terms of just what drives their desire for information more generally, there's some interesting findings there.
Yeah, I mean, what's in my next question, just you answered, probably very briefly. And then, the basic, bottom line, for these North Korean who are interested in the foreign information and foreign contents, they are very well aware of they are in danger, to be punished in a very severe way, but they are still taking a risk. I think this is probably obvious the answer too, but why they are doing it? I mean, just curiosity that actually overwhelm this the risk of being punished in a severe way, even death.
There is it's a great question. Like, why do people risk? I still think the risk of death is an edge case. The number of times that we think that people have been executed over the consumption and spread of foreign information is not zero, but it's not every day. But nevertheless, like, the threat of punishment is there. I mean, it's very clear that the North Korean regime feels very threatened by this information. I use the balloons because it's the most recent example, but the law, what is it? The law on the elimination of reactionary thought and culture, in English anyway, is a clear reaction of the North Korean regimes to a demand for foreign information, which they think threatens to undermine their legitimacy. Obviously, people want the information. The best way is to sit down with someone who is from North Korea, maybe that's a little bit more recently defected, and be like, what information do you want? Most of the time it's dramas, right? They just want to be entertained. They're completely aware that people in other free places watch drama for leisure. And I don't know about you, but I watch dramas pretty regularly of the South Korean variant and of, American, Canadian, whatever. So there's I think a basic human instinct to be free in consuming the information you want for entertainment purposes, but also for curiosity with regards to the outside world, because human beings are curious by nature. We seek to know for the sake of knowing. And I think that is both a quality of human behavior and also something with, in the case of highly autocratic regimes, extreme political implications, because North Korea seeks to control that. Doesn't stop people, though.
Yeah, I think so. And then, you mentioned about those distribution media, say USB. Actually, you using USB for your front page for your presentation. How can we approach this role of USB in then distributing and then receiving this information, foreign information?
So what we learned is, unsurprisingly, people tell us through the survey, through our interviews, and if you just do a bit of background research, you can find this too, that USBs are the most preferred distribution media for people seeking outside information. It's also most likely to increase the probability that it will be used, as one could infer from their own research or survey experiment findings. They're mobile, they're easy to conceal, and they're easy to use. So all things considered, the distribution media type is USB. I will note that CDs and DVDs are also valuable. And the reason for that is a lot of the devices people use to consume the media often have a CD drive. And one thing that people complain about sometimes is USBs break. Yeah, but CDs break too. But in any case, CD, DVD, or USB is the distribution media that people prefer and they most use. And this is sort of corroborated by just talking to people about their experiences actually using the media.
Okay.
Yeah.
We are done. Thank you so much. Today, we are hosting Professor Benjamin Silberstein, who is a senior lecturer, assistant professor, and then Hebrew University, Jerusalem. And then he's going to make a short presentation on a lecture on the North Korean daily politics between coercion and then resistance, past, present, and then future. Thanks for accepting our invitation to this project. And then the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. And really a big thanks to you for organizing this event and this series. I found it very, very interesting to follow. And I'm very glad to get to give this talk here today. So I'm sure many of you already know about this, depending on who's watching. But since the 1990s famine and the beginning of marketization of the North Korean economy, the rise of farmers markets and also of private business or semi-private business, there's often been the sense that the rise of this market economy and not least the smuggling of foreign culture would lead to a sort of social revolution as the so-called 장마당 generation grew up and came of age. So their exposure to things like entrepreneurship and private economic activity, as well as foreign or mostly South Korean culture, would make them more independently minded and decrease the legitimacy of the state in their eyes as compared to their parents and especially grandparents' generation. But things were never that simple. North Korean society and its relationship to the state cannot be understood in a simple linear fashion or anything like that. Kim Jong-un has cracked down harshly on smuggling and uncontrolled foreign trade and sought to regulate market trade in a much more strongly and in a much more comprehensive way, while also strengthening the state's role in the economy. And all these social changes that we see in North Korea, I believe, should be seen as sort of negotiated between the state and the citizens, often as a sort of tug of war between the two. So while the regime can certainly increase its social and economic controls, setting stricter frames for the private economy, making it more dangerous to consume foreign culture, getting rid of these things entirely from North Korean society is just not possible, or it's very, very unlikely. With the markets, the state doesn't even seem to have any ambition of that sort, as I'll get into in a second. So today I'm very happy to get to make some brief points about this development and its implications for North Korean society. But I actually want to start with questioning one of the common baselines for this discussion, namely that North Koreans were fully, entirely dependent on and obedient to the state under the Kim Il-sung era between 1948 and 1994. Both scholars on North Korea and often North Koreans themselves sometimes refer to the decades between the 1960s and the 1990s as a period when the North Korean system, quote unquote, functioned as intended, a sort of golden age, if you will, because North Korea was much wealthier and the state could actually fund its programs and policies. So the public distribution system for food, for example, had enough to distribute the basics to the public, so that people were supposedly entirely dependent on the state. And the state control over the information environment was supposedly total. People's only cultural consumption came from what the state produced, and which is of course heavily laden with political propaganda and similar messages. Another assumption is that there was next to no disobedience in society. People were too scared of the possibility or the possible consequences to speak critically with one another about the regime and its policies. So this is the way that I argue that North Korean society between, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, has tended to be seen. The thing is, things were always more complicated than that. So to try to better understand North Korean society before the famine, I interviewed approximately 40 North Korean refugees, mostly aged 50 and above, a few years back, in sort of long form interviews. So no survey research or anything like that. And I learned some fascinating things from talking to these people. So for one, contrary to the claim about the North Korean state as historically having provided entirely for its citizens everything they need, most interviewees agreed that this was never fully the case. People, at least in the provinces outside of Pyongyang and other major cities, always had to supplement the food they were given by the state by exchanging with neighbors and friends, and sometimes borrowing food from one another. People only got a certain proportion of what they needed from the state, perhaps the most important basis in the form of rice and other cereal, but this was never entirely enough. And the same goes for culture. Several interviewees, especially those from the intelligentsia that I was fortunate enough to speak with, have recounted to me that even in the 60s and 70s, arguably when the regime's social control reached its very top, its peak, they found ways to read books that had been banned in favor of writings about the great leader only. Some kept books that had been banned and cleaned out from the library shelves they kept them in their homes. Other people borrowed them from friends who had access to banned materials through various connections. And many interviewees also told me about how they always had some friends and family, usually people very close to them, that they always trusted enough to speak critically about the government with. And despite the obvious danger of doing so, They talked about their true sentiments and feelings and thoughts about society and the regime, only with those that they really trusted, and never when they could be overheard by a third party that might report them. Now, none of this evidence is statistical. Obviously, these are impressions that I've gathered up from speaking with people who experience these things. But these are patterns of behavior that have been explained to me by so many North Koreans as to make it reasonable to question many supposed facts or many things that we supposedly know about North Korea before the famine. Disobedience and lawbreaking have undoubtedly increased from the 1990s. There's no doubting that. But these phenomena didn't entirely start there. So how should we understand the current relationship between citizens and the state? One of the most interesting things, in my opinion, about the rise of the semi-legal market economy is the potential for a sphere of its own to take shape through the markets beyond the state. Now, it's crucial to remember that the state is not absent in the private economy, far from it. Traders on the official markets, the 종합시장, pay a fee, for example, to the local government's market administration bureau. Sometimes, well, a lot of the times, there are other sorts of bribes involved that people need to pay in order to trade on the market with authorization and some level of safety. Those North Koreans have become entrepreneurs by starting companies in various forms, pretty much always do so by contracting with a state-owned enterprise to use its cover for this business activity, making the business legally and formally legitimate. And in many ways, the market system has grown in tandem with the state, not against it. But still, market actors generally have to write and uphold their own rules because there's basically no law and no institutions protecting this economic activity. So how do people create and uphold these norms, like following through on contracts and promises, for example, in the market sphere? To a large extent, market activity relies on the market actors themselves, the people involved, creating social capital, or what we tend to call social capital, through repeated exchanges and trust building amongst themselves. And this is really the only way the private or the semi-private economy can work in the absence of state laws and clear regulations. This is also an issue that I've tried to learn more about by interviewing people who have left North Korea, so-called or commonly called defectors, people who were previously involved in market trade while they were living in North Korea. And I want to suggest a few general patterns that we can see in this process. For one, people very often tend to rely on family and friendship ties in their economic dealings. So people they already trust. Something that other scholars have pointed out as well. One woman that I interviewed, just to give one example out of several, came to run a fairly successful business trading in Chinese imported clothes and North Korean sourced seafood. And she only came to this trade because she happened to get to know some Chinese traders who were coming to North Korea and sometimes stayed at her family's house in Musan in the northeast of North Korea. She got to know them over time and got the idea to sell the clothes that they were bringing to sell on to North Korean distributors by interacting with them. So by talking to these people and getting to know them, she got the idea that eventually led to her business endeavor. So what she would do is she would take the clothes to a market in Chongjin, sell them there, and then purchase seafood from local vendors and take it back to Musa and sell it back to the same Chinese traders who would then in turn sell it in China. And this is one of many stories out there about family connections and ties formed in this context of trust leading to successful business. Another crucial factor is repeated interactions. Now, these are essential for building social capital and trust in any economy and in the North Korean economy as well. I spoke with, for example, with one woman from North Korea about this who used to sell gold to Chinese traders and an illegal form of trade because the state is supposed to have a full monopoly on it because it owns all the natural resources in the country. So this makes it particularly risky. And she illustrated very well the importance of repeated action and interactions for trust. She would sell her gold on credit by tossing it over a border fence into China, where it was then collected by her Chinese contacts. And they would sell the gold in China, and then only afterwards would they pay her. And only because of the known reputation of these Chinese traders as trustworthy, because they'd already been through a countless number of these interactions before, only thanks to that reputation and these repeated interactions could this sort of trade happen. And I want to stress that there are countless examples like these, and they illustrate these mechanisms of trust and reputation, a form of social capital that make the North Korean market system function. And this doesn't necessarily translate into anything like a civil society per se, but at the very least, the market sphere has become a sort of force in its own right, which the state has to take into account when making policy. Should the rules become too strict, or fees or bribes become prohibitively expensive, too expensive for people to actually pay them, local governments know that people might even show open discontent or simply just trade less, which also would hurt state finances by lowering the amount of taxes and fees the local government can collect. So where does this development stand under Kim Jong-un? On the one hand, Kim has been and continues to be, despite some changes in the past couple of years, much friendlier to the market system as such in its entirety than his father, Kim Jong-il. Under Kim Jong-il, we saw repeated crackdowns and attempts to curb the market system by closing down major markets, and of course, by redenominating the currency in 2009, wiping out the savings of most market traders. Now, Kim Jong-un's record is mixed. It's not a clear story in one direction. Under the rule of Kim Jong-un, the state has expanded the scope of marketplaces condoned by the state, making their space physically larger, and things like rules and fees for market trade have become more standardized and clearer. Kim Jong-un hasn't launched, and this is very significant, I think, he has not launched any general crackdown against the markets in the same way that his father did. On the other hand, Kim Jong-un has sought to make state control over the economy stronger and more centralized. At the 8th Party Congress in early 2021, Kim made a big speech emphasizing the, quote, state's unified guidance, unquote, over the economy, highlighting especially the state's role in the service sector, which is one where marketization has reached particularly far. And this has been followed up by similar rhetoric on various occasions. There's a multitude of examples out there, as well as a general tightening of conditions for private entrepreneurs contracting with state firms, and especially in foreign trade. And this is part of a bigger story of Kim Jong-un seeking to enhance state control overall of society. He's more or less declared war on what he terms reactionary capitalist tendencies, such as consuming South Korean culture. This has been a clear pattern, in fact, under Kim Jong-un. And when we look back and try to find the roots of it, they go back at least to 2014. But it's been strongly emphasized it was strongly emphasized in late 2020 when the Supreme People's Assembly, North Korea's rubber stamp parliament, adopted a law against so-called reactionary thought. The law made it punishable by up to 2 years in a labor camp for using South Korean vocabulary and accents, and possibly death for those caught disseminating this sort of culture. And one interview study with North Korean defectors in 2017 showed that the vast majority of interviewees believed it had become significantly more dangerous under Kim Jong-un to consume foreign culture. It was always forbidden, but under Kim Jong-un, it's become much more of a risk. We don't need to look far for examples. If you go to publications like the Daily NK, they often report several times a week about people being given very excessive punishments for even small acts that suggest a cultural influence from South Korea, such as using certain words or dialects in public. So to sum up, or to round off, how can we expect this development to continue and to shape state-society relations in North Korea going forward? First, I want to emphasize, as one always should when talking about developments inside North Korea, that getting reliable information about the country, which is, it's never been easy, but it's gotten increasingly more difficult since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So all testimonies that we have should, of course, be taken with a grain of salt. Now, that said, I believe that given what we know about social and economic control in North Korean history and in the more recent past, there are a few predictions that we can make. First of all, economic control will most likely always be, as I said in the beginning, negotiated between the regimes, or a negotiation between the regimes' interests and goals and the economic reality for people on the ground, rather than just a top-down policy-making process without consideration of the consequences. At least since the 2009 currency redenomination, but I would argue even before then, the regime has been wary or careful with enacting policies that are widely unpopular among the population, or to risk outright shows of discontent by the public. Another example of this is, which has garnered far less attention, is the public bonds program that was launched in April 2020, but rolled back only a few months later. Second, and relatedly, it's unlikely that the state will be able to dramatically change its relationship to the citizens or those between market actors. The state would need to replace or dramatically take control of the market system, which would be extremely challenging. Not to say impossible. There's been some attempts at restarting the public distribution system of food in the early 2000s, and also over the past couple of years. And the state also does appear to have tried to monopolize trade in staple foods like grain. And of course, the state could increase its share in basic food trade, especially if it gets food and economic assistance from China and Russia. But it cannot replace the market system entirely, and it knows this very well. The simple reason is that people depend on it for such a wide range of goods, and state distribution just cannot compete. The mechanisms and the resources aren't there. Third, and finally, although the state can make it much more dangerous and risky to consume foreign culture, it's unlikely to succeed in stopping its spread entirely. It may succeed better in some environments than others, like Pyongyang with its relatively tight social controls compared to the provinces. But doing so in the more remote parts of the country would take a concerted effort by the security apparatus on various levels that the state very likely lacks the capacity to pull off. This is especially true because, of course, state security agents themselves are often heavily involved in smuggling. We also know anecdotally that they, just like many other North Koreans, often consume foreign culture themselves. The number of people watching South Korean dramas and the like in North Korea may already be significantly lower than a decade ago, but there will always be people prepared to take the risk for entertainment and a glimpse of the outside world. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for giving me the time, and I'm sorry for going over by a couple of minutes.
Thank you for your very interesting and a very systematic analysis of North Korean state-society relationship last, I think, 6 decades?
6 decades and 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Yep.
I think this is really pretty, we liked it. And
Great.
I have a few questions, to start.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, you emphasize the importance of family and then friendship ties in the state-society relationship, especially in a market economic system in North Korea. Can you elaborate a little bit, and then why they need this type of very high level of so-called social trust or family trust or relative trust?
Yeah. No, I'm happy to. I mean, I think the main reason is that because there is no real framework of the rule of law or protections for private property and the like, people have to contracts. Yeah, exactly. Contracts. Yeah, exactly. People tend to do this kind of unprotected economic activity with people that they trust, where there is some kind of relationship there already. They know them, and I mean, this is, I didn't go into it that much in the lecture, but when I interviewed people from North Korea, it's not just family ties, you know. Also, and I think it's very often when people get started in market trade, they'll just offhandedly explain that, like, oh well, I knew this person and they knew someone else who could provide me with this. Like, there is a feedback loop, sort of. It's not like you do this with people that you don't know who might just, you know, take your money and run or something like that. These relationships between family and friends or acquaintances, they provide a level of security that the state framework just cannot provide. So I think that's why, even beyond like close friendships or close family relationships, a lot of this activity tends to happen with, you know, people who know someone who knows someone, so that there's kind of a circle of sorts. Yeah,
but at the same time, if you just depend on family ties and then, you know, friend ties, and then the size of scale of business cannot be very big and large. And then, but, you know, this the nature of the capitalism always tended to make this type of, you know, scale of business larger and then bigger. Then we are not gonna witness this type of, you know, larger and bigger business, you know, model in North Korea sometime pretty soon.
Yeah, no, I think that's. I think there's two things to say about that. One is that there are more sort of major business operations. I frankly, I think it's hard to say how many they are and how many people who are engaged in market trade in North Korea actually manage to grow a sort of, I don't want to say empire, but, you know, grow a business that's, you know, not just gathering some gold and selling it to Chinese traders, but like importing massive amounts of like motorcycles and like big things that you require serious connections for. I mean, these operations certainly exist, and some of them are very successful. And I think that in those cases, again, I do think that a lot of people first get started through these relationships with people, you know, family or people that they have some sort of either first degree or second degree relationship to. But then when you expand above that, then this dynamic of repeated interactions becomes very important, because reputation is a golden resource, especially in every economy, arguably, but especially in an economy like the North Korean one, or society like the North Korean one, where there's no legal state framework protecting you. So the reputation of economic actors in following through on their promises and on their commitments, that is something very important. And I would say also, sorry for going on for a long time, but I would also say that the people that I have personally interviewed about this, they tended to be lower level market traders, so not people involved in like a big operation. Some of them did hire other people, they did employ other people to help them with their activity. And one thing I was trying to understand is why they didn't expand more. Like, if they were successful in a certain type of trade, why wouldn't they expand this beyond what they were doing? And a lot of people would say that it's for them, it was just not worth the risk or the effort. They were making enough money to support themselves and their families, and they didn't really feel the need to go bigger and to make very significant amounts of money. And that's, of course, it's not true for everyone, but I do think it's true for a pretty significant segment of market actors in North Korea, because the effort and risk that's required in sort of going bigger and leveling up your business and really, becoming a real wealthy capitalist, it involves, it's very difficult to do. So I think that and it's very risky to do. And I think that prevents a lot of people from doing it, because it's just not worth it.
So they get a lot of might, if you get too rich, and then you get the attention, from the state, and then that might be, state court in many senses. It can be applied to your business and your family and then your friends, and then that type of. So this is pretty interesting equilibrium, and then this, market, the system business world and then incentive for the the expanding their business. Of course, it's just more like your human nature, to make more money and then more profit and to get richer. But at the same field or formally or informally monitored by state apparatus, security apparatus, and then they are watching, and then sometimes might give you the warning. Then that's the limit. Don't just go too far. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
This is the interesting part. And then you mentioned about Kim Jong-un era since 2011, and Kim Jong-un actually become a regime itself. It's a very market friendly and more market at least than his father's regime, Kim Jong-il regime. But at the same time, it's try to control the society from the cultural and then ideological perspective. And then I think this is more like become cliche type of question for every North Korea watchers. How the Kim Jong-un regime and then those the leadership say strike a balance between this market-friendly policy, at the same time the growing and stronger and expensive centralized state coercion. That's no. I mean, they cannot be comparable in say our economics and the political economy textbook.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right that it's. Do you agree that there is a balance being struck? Like the cliche? Do you think it's?
It's. I think they are trying to find the equilibrium in the striking a balance, but I think it's they are still figuring out how to different elements in the very highly autocratic regime. And then,
and sorry to cut you off. I didn't mean to, but I think I would say, and this is something that's I think one of the bigger questions is, and I would argue that we have the answer at least for now. Kim Jong-un might want to control the economy overall much more, and sort of make. And I think that partially this is even a good thing to create frameworks for create a transparent-ish system for market trade and having clear rules for how market administration should work and clear fees and things like that. But it's again a very boring academic answer. I think it really remains to be seen in a possible potential future.
I don't think you'll see Russian type of oligarchy in North Korea pretty soon. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for your excellent the lecture. At the same time, very interesting and stimulating Q&A session. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for a great discussion. It was really fun, and I hope to see you in person soon.